season. Just doing a little bit of housekeeping. Wanted to let everybody know that in 2021, and I know that's a long ways off, they're going to have the moving wall that'll be, the Vietnam moving wall that'll be down at Hueneme Beach. So it'll be for Memorial Day. So I can give you a rough, and you don't have to get you the information out, but on the 31st is Memorial Day. So we're going to have a flyover and quite a number of other events. And on the Saturday before, there's going to be a 5 and 10K run walk for veterans. Plus, there's going to be a sand sculpture contest revolving around veterans. And then that'll be on the Saturday before. And on Friday, they're gonna have a little movie in the park, so that it'll tie in with the Vietnam Wall that'll be there. They anticipate that we'll have probably about 10 to 20,000 people. And so this is gonna be quite big, and it's, you know, I mean, you can see how long it takes to get them here. And we have 2 naval bases that are right here, and I have the names of all the deceased from the sea beach and from Ventura County, so that you'll also have those names. So that's just giving you a little bit. So we'd like to welcome today Jim Kosinski, who's from Channel Islands Museum, Maritime Museum. And this is second time or third time that Jim's spoken? Third time. And we appreciate you doing it. The next time we'll have John out there in his thong and get people in here. And we're sorry, I must be something going on today. But we'd like to welcome you, Jim. We've been looking forward to this. And thank you for coming, and you can get the show on the road.
Hey, we'll have a police department here.
When we mention the Civil War, most often it's in the context of the land battles, Shiloh, Antietam, Gettysburg. But there was another side to the story. It was played out on the water. So this morning I'd like to cover some of that as well. Now, our Civil War began in April of 1861 when the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter. Wasn't a surprise, of course. Tensions had been mounting for 10 years. The issue of slavery is most often seen as the cause for war, though there were cultural, economic, political differences between the North and South. By the mid-1800s, the economies of many northern states had shifted from farming to industry. Immigrants by the thousands were now arriving in America. And some came through the southern ports, to be sure, but the vast majority of them dropped their anchor in the north. And they were living in the big cities, working in the factories. The North had greater congressional representation, and so legislation enacted in Washington regarding water use, land use, taxes, often reflected a more northern thinking. Now, the South, on the other hand, maintained a farming economy, largely in tobacco, rice, cotton. This economy was dependent on slave labor. Abraham Lincoln was seen as an abolitionist, that is, someone against slavery. When he was elected, southern states believed their way of life to be coming to an end. Southern leadership felt they had every right to leave the Union and create their own country called the Confederate States of America. Abraham Lincoln said they did not have that right, and the war began. Now, the question of civil war inevitably raises issues of patriotism, treason, and loyalty, and these conflicting loyalties were at the heart of the matter in our Civil War. There were many cases of agonizing decisions made by military officers and families on both sides who searched their souls to discover where lay the higher loyalty. Robert E. Lee's case is best known. He was offered command of both armies. Navy Admiral David Farragut, also born and raised in the South, believes secession to be terribly wrong, as he and his Southern-born wife moved to New York, leaving family and friends behind. And there were hundreds of others in the Marines, in the Navy, and the Army who faced the same decision, and when forced to choose, many elected to go south, often splitting families.
It's hard to hear.
It's hard to hear?
Yeah.
Can you turn it up? I can make it louder if you want, sure. Keep talking.
How's that? Is that any better?
Just keep talking.
Oh, is that any better? Is that any better?
Can you raise that up from?
Just keep, no, don't, that's as loud as you get, so please don't.
How's that? Is that any better? How's that? Is that better? All right. I was saying, Robert E. Lee's case is best known because he was offered command of both armies. Navy Admiral David Farragut, who was also born and raised in the South, thought secession to be terribly wrong as he and his Southern-born wife moved to New York, leaving family and friends behind. And there were hundreds of others in the Navy and the Army and the Marines who faced the same decision, and when forced to choose, many elected to go south, often splitting families, while others upheld the oath they'd taken and remained loyal to the Union. Now this war, the Civil War, would be different from our Revolutionary War fought 85 years earlier, because now the roads were much better, the railroads were expanding, the telegraph had replaced the messenger horse. Both sides would benefit from the lessons learned in Europe's Crimean War fought a few years earlier, where written field reports, photography, nursing championed by Florence Nightingale, it all brought a professionalism to warfare. At the beginning, President Lincoln and his advisors believed the best way to end this conflict with the fewest casualties would be to choke off the economy of the South by laying siege to all of its southern water ports. This was characterized as the Anaconda Plan. That is, to blockade all of the southern ports along the Atlantic and Gulf Coast and all navigable rivers, because in spite of the fact that the roads were better, the ocean and the rivers still carried the bulk of the traffic, and the North was convinced the side that controlled the waterways would win the war. But it wasn't an easy thing to do, because there was 3,500 miles of coastline. And the Union only had 42 ships in commission, and many of them were on assignment overseas. So the Union went on an immediate shipbuilding program, building what they called 90-day gunboats, because that's how long it took to build one. But it would be a while before they had enough built to blockade the ports. So the North immediately began to commandeer any manner of vessel they could get their hands on, put a few guns on it, from cargo ships to ferry boats. They used them for blockade duty. Now the South, on the other hand, they didn't have a navy at all. So the Confederacy captured any Union ships that were still trapped in their ports. They put a few guns on them, and from this, a Confederate navy was built. But it wasn't big enough. To put more guns on the water, Confederate President Jefferson Davis turned to privateering. That is, the arming and commissioning of privately owned vessels. Well, with the Navy, of course, you're going to need sailors. And this would prove to be a problem for the Navy, for the Confederate Navy throughout the war. Many of the officers who served in the U.S. Navy were from southern states. So the Confederacy did not have a problem finding naval officers. But because of its strong attachment to the land, they had a hard time crewing their ocean-going vessels. The Confederate Navy had to rely on foreign adventure seekers. This made the Confederate Navy very multicultural. The South was at a great disadvantage. because almost all of the heavy industry, the armament factories, the shipyards were in the north. Plus the north had a much greater population, 21 million compared to 9 million in the south. About 3 million of them were slaves. But the south wasn't without its strengths. They would be fighting a defensive war on their own territory. And as I mentioned, many of the military officers were from the south, so the south had good military leadership. And of course, they had cotton. Now the south couldn't match the north's industrial strength, and so they turned to Europe to provide them with the arms and the supplies they would need. Blockade runners did a brisk trade, sneaking arms and supplies in and cotton out. The South used the cotton as collateral to buy these arms. But the South knew it would need to do better than just simply sneak arms and supplies in the back door. If they were to win this war, they would need to break the blockades. And they had a plan to do that. For generations, the workers around Liverpool and the north of France owed their livelihoods in the textile mills to the flow of cheap cotton from the southern states. The loss of this cotton would be a devastating financial blow, not only for these workers, but for their country's economies. And so for this reason, the Confederacy was sure King Cotton would finance this war, and England or France would come to their aid militarily to save their economies. They were banking on it. Well, how to finance this war weighed heavily on President Lincoln's mind too, because textile workers in the northern states were also dependent on southern cotton. And it posed a dilemma because cotton was 70% of the U.S. export, and the federal government could hardly expect to have a favorable trade balance without cotton. And so a decision was made to quietly allow this cross-the-lines trade in cotton. This didn't always translate well in the field, where treasury agents and generals pursued their own agendas. For many southern white farmers, selling their crops to the northern brokers was the only way, who paid in gold, was the only way for them to avoid starvation. And southern armies were also dependent because they were desperate for essential supplies like medicine and salt for food preservation, not to mention Yankee dollars. At this time in our country's history, many still felt a greater allegiance to their state than they did to the country. Within 4 months of South Carolina's secession, hundreds of military officers resigned their commissions and joined Southern forces. For most, it was just simply a matter of them returning to their home state. But for naval personnel on ships overseas and diplomats abroad, it was more complicated. The enemy within became an immediate problem for the federal government. All government workers, even those of long standing, along with all military officers, were now required to sign an oath of allegiance. And this questioning of loyalty created many hard feelings. Now, on paper at least, the war should not have lasted so long. The much larger northern armies with their greater resources should have quickly crushed the southern resistance. But the North was burdened with bureaucracy, inefficiency, timid, incompetent military commanders, not to mention railroad owners who were more bent on turning a profit than they were in helping the cause. Now the Confederacy, on the other hand, they had a more relaxed style of government. They quickly promoted their officers. They embraced new weapon ideas, and they encouraged creative, out-of-the-box thinking. Now earlier I mentioned the South had a plan to break through the blockades, and that plan centered around buying ironclad vessels from European shipyards. And to get around the neutrality laws, the shipyards were encouraged to tell their governments that they were building these ironclads for other countries, Egypt, Turkey, Russia. The Union had spies over there. They saw what was going on, and when the U.S. government threatened war against England or France, they quickly confiscated those ironclad vessels. But nonetheless, several steam-powered wood commerce raiders were built for the Confederacy. In fact, 70 blockade runners were built on the River Mersey, and Liverpool factories turned out all manner of illegal arms and provisions for the Confederacy. Early in the war, President Lincoln said, if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. In other words, Abraham Lincoln's focus was on preserving the Union, saving the Union. And many feared that if that was to be the cause for war, England or France might change their neutrality laws and come in on the side of the South just to save their own economies. But when the president signed the Emancipation Proclamation, it changed the purpose of the war from preserving the Union to preserving human freedom. And since slavery had been outlawed in Europe decades earlier, what nation would fight another who was trying to end slavery? So the Emancipation Proclamation really dashed any hope the Confederacy had for European military intervention. I'd like to talk just a moment about weapons, new weapons that came about as a result of the Civil War. For hundreds of years, the major navies of the world fired broadsides from smoothbore muzzle-loaded cannons. But the Civil War brought new innovations. Now, some of these new weapons, like the underwater mine and the exploding projectiles, were already under development in Europe. They were just waiting for the refinements that a war can bring. Weapons that may have taken another generation to build were now being rushed into the battle, and America was the proving ground. The caliber of the guns back in those days was often determined by the weight of the shot they fired, 10 pounder, 12 pounder, 24 pounder. Navy Admiral John Dahlgren designed a series of weapons for the Navy. His guns were bottle-shaped, which equalized the strain around the breech where most failures occurred. And this allowed for Dahlgren's cannons to fire a much heavier shot, well over 100 pounds. Other innovations that came about during the Civil War included the rotating turret. Guns could now be aimed without having to turn the entire ship. And this allowed for warships to have fewer but larger guns. In the history of armed conflict, a weaker nation will inevitably resort to guerrilla tactics, to unorthodox methods of fighting, and invention of new weapons. Sound familiar? What the Confederate Navy lacked in resources, they made up for with ingenuity. The Confederate Navy was a miracle of improvisation. It not only perfected the underwater mine, called a torpedo, but they also built the first submarine that sank a warship. CSS Hunley was a submarine. It was built from a 40-foot long steam boiler. It was powered by 8 men turning cranks that operated a propeller. And on a cold night, they cranked their way out of Charleston Harbor, about 8 miles, where the Union had set up a blockade. And then using their spar, they stuck a keg of explosive into the side of one of the blockading ships, the Housatonic. They tripped the lever, they backed off, and blew the back of the ship off, sinking it. Now, unfortunately for the Hunley crew, they lost their way going back, and they were never seen again. That is, not until the year 2000, when the Hunley was raised from the mud. The crew was given a proper burial, And the Hunley is now undergoing restoration and will someday be on display in Charleston. Well, the Confederates were not only ingenious, they were also opportunists. Early in the war, the Union had to abandon their big Norfolk Navy Yard to the advancing Southern forces. And they tried to destroy all of the ships that were in port so they wouldn't fall into Confederate hands. And one of them was the steam frigate Merrimac, which you see ablaze here. But the Confederates refloated it, and they covered it with 4 inches of flattened railroad iron plate. They rechristened it the Virginia. And this then became the South's first ironclad vessel. And on a cold morning in March 1862, the Virginia slowly made its way down the Elizabeth River out to Hampton Roads, to where the Union had set up a blockade. And then using it, well, when the blockading ships in the sword batteries saw that unusual craft, they opened with everything they had, but the cannonballs just bounced off. And then using its powerful ram and its guns, the Virginia sank 2 of the blockading ships. And it was going after a third, but night was coming on, the tide was falling. And so the captain turned the big ironclad around, and he anchored right over here on the other side of Hampton Roads. Here's the blockading fleet. He had plans to go back the next morning and finish the job. He was in for a surprise, because that night the Union brought in an equally strange-looking craft. It only had 2 guns, but they were on a rotating turret. And you will remember that famous battle from your high school history. It was the battle of the Merrimac, and the Monitor was actually the Monitor and the Virginia. And the 2 ironclad vessels went at it head to head, and after 4 hours, neither one of them could do enough damage to cause the other to surrender. So the Merrimac then went back down the Elizabeth River, never to see action again. And the Union continued to block Hampton Roads. Many historians refer to our Civil War as the first modern war. It was the proving ground where railroads were first used for mass mobilization, and where technology played a major role in the form of portable telegraph wagons and observation balloons. 620,000 would die in American Civil War. This at a time when we had 1/10 of today's population. The toll would have been higher were it not for the work of volunteer nurses. It was the proving ground for nursing in America. The work of volunteer nurses on both sides, Sally Tompkins for the Confederacy, Dorothea Dix for the Union, they showed that contrary to Victorian notions, women could provide excellent medical care for men they were not related to without damaging their reputations. The work of and influence of Florence Nightingale could be found in the hospital on both sides. It's often thought of as a war of brother against brother. There's factual support for this. There were many families, particularly along these border states, Tennessee, Kentucky, who were so torn by the war they could never reconcile. Many marriages suffered. There were certainly many in the North who were not opposed to slavery, and many in the South who were against it. Robert E. Lee claimed he was against slavery, and he welcomed the Emancipation Proclamation, though he owned 200 slaves. He was fighting, he said, because he couldn't take up arms against his home state. But many wonder if Virginia had stayed in the Union, would he have remained loyal? Well, blockade runners, like you see here, are often thought of as the more dashing, romantic, exciting part of the Civil War. But the other side of that coin were the much feared and hated commerce raiders. And although they had little impact on the overall outcome, these commerce raiders took a heavy toll on U.S. merchant ships. The Raider Alabama we see here was one of the more destructive. The Union had been looking for the Raider for a couple years. When it got wind, the Alabama was in Cherbourg, France, taking on coal, doing some minor repairs. So the Union warship Kearsarge was sent there to wait offshore. The two captains knew one another. They were former friends. They'd served together in the U.S. Navy. Both were Southerners. Well, Captain Sims of the Alabama was in a spot. Under international law, he could remain in port a little longer and complete his repair. But he also knew the longer he stayed in port, the greater chances more Union warships would show up. So he had to make a decision. Should he surrender? Should he try to make a run for it? Or should he fight? The two ships were fairly evenly matched. The Kearsarge carried heavier guns. The guns on the Alabama were the newer type. They were easier to load and aim. They had a greater range. Captain Sims of the Alabama felt he could win this duel from a distance. And besides, he wanted to show the French critics that he, in fact, his Raider could fight a real battle and not just sink unarmed merchant ships. So he made his decision. He would fight. The two ships met offshore, 6 miles. And by now, thousands of people were lining the bluffs. Those with yachts went out, some from clear across the English Channel, 100 miles away, to watch this epic battle. Well, according to the eyewitnesses, as expected, the Alabama opened first and fast. But the shots were high. They were wide. They couldn't see to score a significant hit. The Kearsarge held its fire, presented a narrow profile, closed the gap. When it got within range, it made a port turn and opened with its big Dahlgren cannons. They fired a 136-pound ball, and some of them went all the way through the Alabama. According to those who were there, they said it was obvious that the soldier of fortune sailors aboard the Alabama were no match for the well-trained Union gunners. And within 1 hour, the Alabama sank beneath the waves. Well, the Kearsarge immediately sent out boat crews to rescue the survivors. But some of them got away, including Captain Sims. He was rescued by a yacht owned by a wealthy London businessman and taken back to London, no doubt much to the chagrin of Captain Winslow of the Kearsarge. In 1984, the wreck of the Alabama was found in 600 feet of water off the coast of France, and since that time, the divers from the French and the U.S. Navies have been bringing up some artifacts which are now on display at the Maritime Museum in Mobile, Alabama. In retrospect, the blockade was a powerful weapon. It ruined the Southern economy, and it wasn't, the measure of its success wasn't so much the few ships that got through, but the many that didn't try. An ordinary freighter had no reasonable hope of breaking through the blockade, and so they just stopped calling on southern ports. The war ended almost exactly 4 years after it began, April 1865, when Robert E. Lee, the senior general of the Confederate forces, surrendered his remaining 28,000 troops to Ulysses S. Grant, the senior general of the U.S. forces. This took place in a farmhouse near Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. By now, the Southern economy was in ruins because of the blockade. Everything was in short supply: medicine, clothing, food. The currency was worthless. Inflation was out of control, and the people were weary of war. As predicted, the side that controlled the waterways would win the war. That picture was taken in 1900. 2 Confederates were hung after the war. Historians believe one deserved it, the other was a scapegoat. Ferguson here, he deserved it. He and his rebel band murdered Union soldiers as they lay in their field hospital tents, black soldiers especially. Wirtz was the commandant of the infamous Andersonville prison. It was learned later that he was never given the funds to properly take care of those he was charged with. Many of them died of starvation. Robert E. Lee never went to prison. He became president of a small college in Lexington, Kentucky after the war, even though he vowed he would never leave his home state of Virginia. What is now Arlington National Cemetery had once been his plantation. Jefferson Davis did go to prison for 2 years before being paroled. His legal fees were paid by Northern businessmen. Captain Raphael Semmes of the Alabama eventually made his way back home to Alabama. He was arrested for treason, and he was imprisoned in a hotel room for 3 months, and then allowed to return home a hero. Following the war, he taught literature and philosophy at Louisiana University. He was the editor of the Memphis newspaper for a while, and he ended his working years in private law practice in Mobile. Following the war in 1869, in his memoirs, he defended both his actions at sea and those of the Confederate government. With few exceptions, everyone was allowed to return home, rebuild their lives, rebuild the country. Many wondered why the Confederates were not put on trial for treason. There were certainly many who wanted to see them hang. But legal scholars at the time feared that putting them on trial would put secession to a legal test, and that under the 10th Amendment, secession might be found to be constitutional. But ultimately, the leaders in the North felt that it was better to reconcile with the former Confederates than to extract justice. Several Confederate generals have had forts and naval ships made for them. Fort Bragg, Fort Gordon, Fort Benning, Georgia. Robert E. Lee had a nuclear submarine named in his honor. The current guided missile cruiser USS Chancellorsville is named for a Confederate battlefield victory. Following the war, Alabama State Senator William Norris left the United States and he moved to Brazil, where slavery was still legal. He bought 500 acres, 3 slaves, planted cotton, and tried to live as if the Confederacy had not just collapsed. In time, other Southerners, unable to live under Yankee rule, would come to join him. And today, the descendants of those Confederados still celebrate their heritage, although they tend to downplay their ancestors' ties to slavery. So that's the story as I see it. I hope I've given you some more insight into this chapter of American history. Thank you. If you have any questions, Thank you.
Okay, any questions for people?
Yeah.
I think he's going to have questions.
How do you feel about them removing the memorials that are coming down in the South?
I don't know. I was getting into something political. There's two sides to that. I suppose the memorials in the South are like the memorials to. We're seeing that everywhere, whether it's Southern memorials. Some people complain about the monument down in Long Beach. What was that? The Miner. And then now we're reading about this thing up in the high school. Controversial.
I went camping about a month ago in the Alabama hills, and close by there's a pass called Kearsarge Pass.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you know the origins of them naming those?
I do
two?
not. No, I don't.
Where were you in Alabama?
Alabama Hills near Lone Pine. It's where they filmed all the Western movies.
Okay.
Any other questions? Comments? Well, we have something for you, sir. Mr. Kosinski.
Thank you.
And our suitable for training.
Thank you.
Next week, our speaker is Jerry Olson. Some of you will remember him. He's been here before. He will be talking about the Ventura grades, Ventura County grades, all the roads that were built by sturdy Norwegians. So we'll have that. And as you know, we pass the hat because we don't get any money from the city, just the lights and the water. So we'll pass the hat. Thank you all for coming. We'll see you next week.